Today I thought I would read a story. It's the first day of summer, although where I am it's actually the first day of winter. So I've got some coffee. You can see my nose is actually a bit red, and I've got my warm coat on even though I'm inside. It's kind of chilly. The book that I'm going to read today is called Mirrorstone. This is a really good book, especially if you like to imagine yourself in a different world. I always used to get really scared by the old man on the cover. He's kind of a freak. The Mirrorstone. It's got nice illustrations too. And the Mirrorstone on the front, it glows. The first time he saw it was at the swimming baths. He dried his hair as usual, pulled out his Mickey Mouse comb, glanced in the mirror, and then started back in shock. For the face he saw looking back at him was not his own. It wasn't very different, but something was wrong. The hair was a bit longer, the cheeks were a bit thinner. Do I really look as bad as that? Thought Paul, peering closer, and that's when he got an even bigger shock. For as he moved nearer to the mirror, the other face stayed still. Paul felt himself go very cold at the moment. Then he heard a shout from one of the boys behind him. "Stop staring at yourself, we all know you're ugly." When Paul looked at the mirror again, there, sure enough, was his own freckly, friendly face. Paul was the best swimmer in the school. He was especially brilliant at swimming underwater. He could swim 3 lengths of a pool without once coming up for air. In fact, that day, Paul had spent such a long time underwater, he wondered if this was why he was seeing things. The next day, something very odd happened. He was cleaning his teeth when he was aware of a strange sensation, as if he were being watched. He looked up, and there was the face that wasn't quite his face staring back at him from the mirror. This time it couldn't possibly be him, because Paul had a mouthful of tooth water, and the other face didn't. He smiled as best he could, but the face didn't smile back. Suddenly the bathroom door flew open, and his mom rushed in looking for her earrings. "Are you all right?" she asked. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Paul shook his head. No, I'm fine," he muttered. As soon as his mother had gone, he looked back into the mirror. There was nothing there except a schoolboy with a blob of toothpaste on the end of his chin. After school that day, Paul was walking home past the old TV repair shop when he stopped in amazement. Usually he didn't notice the TV repair shop. It was always closed, and all the televisions inside were broken anyway, but today something was different. On one of the old television sets seemed to be on. He pressed his nose up against the window. What he saw made him suddenly stiffen. The television wasn't actually on at all. It was a reflection on the screen. He could see the cars passing in and the road behind him, but where he should have been was the boy from the mirror. Paul jumped back, and for a moment he saw the face reflected on every dusty screen in the shop. He turned and ran. He dropped his school bag, caught his foot in it, and falling headlong onto the road was nearly run over by a 24 bus. It screeched to a halt, and Paul picked himself up and walked on, trembling. When Paul reached home, instead of throwing his bag at the cat switching on the television, he threw himself at his mother and clung to her. "You're old enough to know about crossing the road, Paul, honestly." He held on to her even harder. "I saw something in the shop. Seeing things? Now come on, you're just shaken up, and a good thing too. You'll be more careful next time. Paul decided to tell her everything, about the faces, about the boy he kept seeing, but she was in a hurry as usual. I'll be back at past. I'll bring a McDonald's. Be good. Just gonna take a sip of coffee. A moment later, he heard the door slam. The flat was very quiet. He sat down until he could feel his heart beating more slowly. His knee hurt. Looking down, he saw a long, dark graze. There was even a smear of blood. He went into the bathroom, switched on the light, and pulled open the door of the cupboard where the medicines were kept. He heard a noise. At first he thought it was the squeak of the cupboard door. Then it came again. This time there was no mistaking it. It was a voice, yet there was no one else in the house. It was coming from the direction of the mirror. Other voices joined in. Paul turned slowly towards the mirror, and there was the boy. "What do you want?" cried Paul. The boy said nothing, but stretched out his hand as if beckoning Paul to follow him. "Where are you going to take me?" asked Paul, trying to keep his voice from shaking. He followed the boy closer to the mirror, and as he did so, an icy breeze blew into the bathroom, although it had no window, and the sound of the voices grew. The bathroom he knew so well began to disappear, and the light became brighter. The wind blew stronger, and the next moment Paul found himself blinking in the middle of a strange city. It was full of towers topped with flags which swirled in the breeze. He recognized nothing and no one. It was like a picture in a history book. He looked behind him, but there was no sign of the bathroom. He looked ahead of him, but there was no sign of the boy. The voices he had heard belonged to a crowd of people who had gathered and were staring at something in a most unfriendly way. Then he realized that they were staring at was him. He followed their eyes down to the tips of his white training shoes with the hole in the toes, and up past the dirty old jeans to the faded Ghostbusters t-shirt, which his mother was always trying to throw away, and he suddenly understood just why they were staring. They'd never seen anyone like him before, and they didn't seem to like it. "Hey, you!" The most evil-looking man stepped forward and came up so close to Paul that he could see bits of cheese in his beard. "You're coming with us." Paul realized that the only brave thing to do was to run away, and without knowing quite where he was going, he raced across the square, through a fountain, scattered a flock of geese, ducked under a balcony, and disappeared down a narrow passage. He could hear shouts behind him getting closer and closer. He caught sight of some stairs leading to a lighted window high up above him and threw himself desperately towards them. The stairs seemed to go on forever, and he was breathing in great gasps as he reached the top and squeezed himself into a darkened doorway. Then the door he was leaning against fell open, and he tumbled into a cluttered, cobwebby room in the middle of which sat a very old man indeed. "Ah, there you are. We've been waiting for you." The man's hair was long and matted as though it hadn't been washed for years. His face was lined and wrinkled as if he'd been through a dozen lifetimes, but the eyes that stared at Paul were bright and piercing. Paul was still gazing at him when he felt himself being pulled into the room. His clothes were wrenched off, and a thick, itchy brown tunic was thrown over his head. He winced as his arm was twisted behind his back, and he was pushed up close to the old man. "Mary, don't be so rough with him," cried the old man. Turning his head to see who was holding him so tightly, Paul was amazed to find himself looking into the face of a girl not much older than himself. She looked scornfully down at him as she dropped his faded Ghostbusters t-shirt into the middle of a fire. The old man nodded at the girl and she released Paul. She reached onto a table full of books and bottles and maps and skulls and picked up a pair of spectacles with very thick glasses, which she seemed to have grown. Which she put on the old man, so that when he looked at Paul, his eyes seemed to have grown 4 or 5 times bigger. Paul felt that they were staring right through him. The old man looked him up and down. Yes, you're just the boy we want, Paul. Just the boy we want. How did you know my name? I know everything. If you know everything, said Paul, then where's the boy who brought me here, the boy in the mirror? Oh, you'll find him, said the old man with a thin smile. Paul looked around the room. It was small and full of measuring instruments, maps, stuffed animals, and old timepieces. Near the window was a telescope of sorts, pointed up into the sky, and beside it a table covered with so many books that it looked to Paul like at least 42 years' homework. You'll find him when you've done what you're here for. What am I here for? Asked Paul, trying to sound brave and failing miserably. The old man raised his head impressively. Let me tell you, my name, he said grandly, is Solomon. He seemed a bit cross when Paul said, Who? And he muttered something rude about the way history was taught. I am, in my humble way, a genius. I've spent my life studying glass, reflections, mirrors, the movement of light on surfaces, and I have in my researches discovered the formula for the perfect mirror, a mirror that would show people themselves as they really are, outside and inside. His eyes fixed on Paul, they shone fiercely. Have you ever seen yourself as you really are, with all your innermost thoughts and feelings visible, so you can never lie to yourself again? Then his eyes clouded over as he went on. Many years ago in the city in which I used to live, I made such a mirror. It was small, no bigger than a large pebble. I called it the Mirrorstone. When the king of the city heard of it, he called me to his court and made me his chief magician, though I prefer to be called a scientist. But he didn't want me. He wanted the Mirrorstone. I knew he would use it only to dominate people, not to increase his understanding of them. So I hid the stone from him, and the king swore that if he could not have it, no one should. He ordered the city's walls to be destroyed, and the Mirrorstone was swept away by the sea. But thanks to Mary's father... Grandfather, said Mary. Yes, of course. I forget how old I am. Thanks to him, I escaped with my life, and since then I've been searching for the Mirrorstone every waking hour. And at last I found it. With that he lifted a cloth, and suddenly the room was full of light. It came from a globe, smaller than a football. Paul stared, open-mouthed. Look in here, cried Solomon in triumph, and drew Paul to his side. When he saw the globe, what he saw in the globe was an underwater world as clearly as if he was there himself, and in the center of it all was a jagged black rock at the very edge of which he could see a luminous stone. More light, ordered Solomon. As Mary held a lamp above the globe, the stone began to shine so vividly that it seemed to rise up out of the sea towards them. I could touch it, gasped Paul. I could hold on to it now. Why don't you try, suggested Solomon. Paul reached for the stone and his hands closed around it, but he couldn't hold it. He tried again, but once more it slipped through. You'll be able to touch it soon, said Solomon, and turning his piercing gaze once more on Paul. Why do you think I wanted a boy who could swim 3 lengths without coming up for air? How did you know I could swim 3 lengths? I told you I know everything. Paul felt a strange chill of fear. There was something in the old man's smile that was only half friendly. And now it's time for you to go, he said. Go where? Paul could feel his heart beating faster. Don't worry, said Solomon. I shall guide you there. But he didn't say anything about coming back. He beckoned Paul towards the luminous globe. Paul looked at the door, but as he did so, he felt Mary's arm firmly on his. She held him fast. Then he had a surprise, for instead of leading him to the globe, she pulled him toward her and hissed in his ear, "Escape! Now!" Paul stared back at her. Mary squeezed his arm again. "You will never come back alive with the Mirrorstone. I can swim. I can swim 3 lengths without... It's not the water that is the danger, Paul. There are other dangers, far worse." "What other dangers?" Before she could reply, Solomon shouted impatiently from beside the globe. "Paul!" Mary pushed him towards the door. "Run!" she screamed. "Mary!" Solomon's voice was full of anger, and Paul ran for dear life, jumping down the stairs to the street 2 or 3 at a time, running fast as he could through the narrow streets while Solomon's voice shrieked high above him. Paul raced on, looking neither left nor right, fearing that if he had so much as caught a glimpse of the window, a glass, or a mirror, Solomon might be there. The voice of the old man grew fainter until it disappeared altogether. It was a long time later, as Paul ran down a rain-soaked alleyway, that he first dared look around him, and he never noticed the gleaming puddle until it was too late. As his foot touched it, he felt, with a terrible sense of helplessness, that he was sinking. To his horror, the puddle seemed to be bottomless, and though he kicked and splashed frantically, the water rose around him. His hands clawed the sides, but he could not save himself, and soon he was completely submerged. He felt himself being sucked under, and there was nothing he could do but hold his breath as he went down and down. Then quite suddenly the turbulent water of the whirlpool gave way to a green and clear calm, and there beneath him was the most extraordinary sight. It was a ruined city, more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen. He swam down across seaweed-covered towers and broken battlements. Fish glided lazily out of chimneys, and crabs scuttled across disused courtyards. The peacefulness and beauty of it all soothed his fear. What had Mary been so worried about? This was the greatest adventure anyone could have, and he was the luckiest boy in the world. Paul found himself before the huge doorway of what looked like a royal palace. He swam inside, doing somersaults along the corridors and floating through a room where a throne stood empty, its golden legs encrusted with barnacles. This room led into a tower, and Paul swam up the narrow stairs faster and faster, until spinning round like a top, he burst out into the sunlight above the waves. Then he found himself in a room with a table laden with food, and he sat down thinking, "I must be in paradise." But there was something strangely familiar about the room. In one corner was a telescope, and by the window were piles of books and papers and bottles and skulls. Paul suddenly realized where he'd seen a room like this before, at Solomon's house. Still trying to escape me, he turned, and there, filling one window, was the unsmiling face of Solomon himself. "Paul, this is not the end of your journey." And as Solomon's face disappeared, a huge wave smashed across the tower and swept through the room. Though Paul tried to hang on, he found himself being washed out and into the sea again. This time he sank down deeper and deeper, deeper than he'd ever been before, but as the sea cleared, he made out far beneath him the rock he had seen in the globe, and beside it, the shining Mirrorstone. If he swam hard, he might just reach it, though he was already deeper than 3 swimming pools on top of each other. With a gigantic effort, he swam down, and at last his feet touched the rock. Placing them firmly on its pitted surface, he edged slowly closer and closer until, stretching himself to his limit, his hand reached the stone. He'd done it. But as he looked into the stone, there was no reflection of the shoals of fish and filtered sunlight around him. All he could see was a darkness, deep and threatening. He turned, and as he did so, the rock moved beneath his feet. He felt himself sliding backwards along its rough, black surface, struggling to keep his balance. Then as he looked down, his heart went suddenly cold. He was staring not at the surface of a rock, but into the center of an enormous eye. The pupil of the eye widened, then narrowed, and Paul could see himself reflected in it, white and shaking with fear. Gripping the Mirrorstone tightly, He flung himself away as the eyeballs seemed to expand and grow red and angry. He looked behind him. The whole rock was alive. It began slowly to uncoil itself into something enormous and glistening and scaly. What had seemed to be solid stone parted to reveal teeth as strong and hard as rock itself. As the thing awoke, it began to hiss, and the water all around swirled and frothed. Paul desperately kicked upwards, heading for the surface. The creature's jagged claws shot out and caught fast in his tunic. He twisted and kicked and writhed and struggled. Looking up, the surface of the sea seemed a million miles away. He felt himself sinking, his lungs bursting, but he was the best swimmer in the school, and he gave one last mighty push. His tunic ripped. The claws of the rock creature slipped from him. Paul shot to the surface and burst out of the water. He never knew fresh air could taste so good. He tried to swim, but he found he could hardly move. There was something stopping him. He put his hand up to push against the unseen force. He turned one way and then the other. Paul realized with a sinking heart that he was trapped. He was surrounded by glass. And outside the glass was a face he recognized only too well. Solomon screamed in triumph as he held high the crystal ball in which Paul squirmed and wriggled. "My plan has worked. Mary, I am a genius." Mary could see Paul struggling, and she knew she had little strength left. Mary could see Paul struggling, and she knew he had little strength left. "Let him go, please let him go." Solomon pushed her to one side. "Not until I see the stone," he cried. Paul clawed his way helplessly around the slippery sides of the globe. "He'll die," shouted Mary. "Send him back where you brought him from before it's too late." "Show me the stone," Solomon screamed, and Paul, with the last ounce of his strength, unclenched his fist and pressed the Mirrorstone to the side of the glass. But as Solomon stared into it, the look of triumph drained from his face. What he saw in there was not the face of a genius. All he saw was a very old man whose face was lined and wrinkled as if it had lived a dozen lifetimes. He started back with a sharp cry of disappointment, and as he did so, the globe slipped from his fingers and rolled onto the table. "Mary," shouted Solomon, "the Mirrorstone!" But Mary did nothing. The globe rolled the length of the table, halted momentarily at the edge, and as Solomon leapt to save it, toppled over and hit the ground with a tremendous crash of splintering, shattering glass. Paul felt himself hurtling through the air, and a moment later he was lying in a heap on his bathroom floor. He lay there gasping for breath, his heart beating like a sledgehammer. He heard the sound of a key in the door, and a light went on in the hallway. Paul? Never had he been so happy to hear his mother's voice. He wanted to run to her, but he hadn't the strength to move. He heard her footsteps across the sitting room, and at last she pushed open the bathroom door. She didn't seem nearly as pleased to see him as he was to see her. She stared open-mouthed, first at the mirror and then at Paul. "What have you been doing?" He looked down at the torn, blood-stained tunic Mary and Solomon had given him, and he knew that no matter how much of the truth he told, he would never be believed. "Only a dressing-up game," he mumbled. "Dressing-up game." She bent down and pulled him up. "Just look at you." She turned him towards what was left of the mirror, and this time, when Paul smiled at his reflection, the face in the mirror smiled